Hello, everybody. Welcome from Belgium to the very first Facebook live show on the Facebook group Aviation Archaeology. As said, this is the first time, so maybe there will be some technical hiccups. Sorry for that. This session will be recorded, so you'll be able to see it on YouTube afterwards. My name is Cindric, and I've been your administrator of this Facebook group for some 5 years now. And this community is growing daily. So now we've got more than 22,500 members from all over the world. Sometimes people ask what this group is for and what should be understood under aviation archaeology. Well, first of all, I would like to state that we in this group do not want to promote any kind of treasure hunting. What we would like to promote is to study the rich history of aviation, and not only of World War II crashes, by looking for remains in situ, also from airfields worldwide. And that these remains are documented, not always retrieved, and that this information is shared. If there is a need of retrieving them or dig them up, lift them up from the water, we prefer seeing these displayed in public in one way or another. So we think it is very important to share the information with the community, and that everything happens, of course, complying with the local law and regulations. That's something I wanted to state on forehand because, well, sometimes I got questions from archaeologists and other people. But as most part of the world, we're in solitary confinement because of Corona, COVID-19, and that gives us time to read a good book. And I had the pleasure to read a fascinating book written by Taras Lyssenko, named The Great Navy Birds of Lake Michigan. And we're happy to have Taras with us, the author of the book. Taras, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hello, Taras. Welcome
Hello.
to the show.
Hi. I'd like to do something. Since we kind of put this together and we didn't know what we were doing, we had to enlist some technical people. So I'd like to identify our technical people. On photographic video technical support, we have Keith Pearson. So I'd like to make sure he's recognized. And our supreme executive producer for this episode is Nicole Alarid. So I'd like everybody to realize that it's not just the two of you. It takes a lot of people to do something like this. And these two are doing a great technical support for us. So, all right, well, thank you.
Well, we've got the first technical hiccup, but because I'm not able to see what's happening on Facebook, so I can't see the questions which might be asked by the people watching this session. So, but we will manage it anyway. So why is the story of Taras so interesting? Well, Taras, your book is called The Aircraft Which Are Found in Lake Michigan. First of all, I think it would be interesting to first point out to our viewers, what is Lake Michigan?
Yeah, so he's gonna roll us a video. And for those that are geographically challenged outside of the United States of America, right smack in the heart of North America are the Great Lakes. And so there's Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. They're some of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world. And so at the beginning of World War II, the United States of America and its allies needed a lot of trained, qualified aircraft carrier pilots. So they picked Lake Michigan just outside of Chicago to bring 2 makeshift aircraft carriers to train what ended up being about 15,000 pilots from the years, from autumn of 1942 to the autumn of 1945. So they were, and doing it there, they had logistical support, and they weren't where the wolf packs, the Kriegsmarine wolf packs could get them in the Atlantic, or the Japanese submarines in the Pacific could get them. So it was an ideal place to train them. It's hard enough to learn how to land on an aircraft carrier, let alone a small aircraft carrier. And then if the aircraft carrier was dodging torpedoes, it would be much harder to learn. So it was an ideal place to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And what kind of aircraft carriers were used for that training?
Well, what they did was they bought 2 excursion vessels, and you can see a photo right now of the excursion vessels, C and B. So they bought 2. They bought the C and B and the Greater Buffalo, and they converted them into the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable. So there you see an image of the USS Wolverine. They were actually very nice pleasure vessels, just like in modern day we take cruises in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean on really nice pleasure vessels. Well, before World War II, you could take those kind of cruises out on the Great Lakes on these 2 ships and other ships. But they purchased these 2 ships. They took all that fancy stuff off, and they put wooden decks on them and made 2 little aircraft carriers that then they were little, apparently. They were a lot smaller than the fleet carriers. So I guess if you could land and take off of one of these, you could do it on a fleet carrier. And so they had to apparently the pilots had to go out and do 8 landings. They had to land first once. They had to go do 8 landings and then 8 takeoffs. And what they would do is they'd be assigned to Glenview Naval Air Station, which at the time was north of Chicago. It's no longer there. And they would get a day or 2 advanced stuff where they'd land on a aircraft carrier mock-up on a field. And then when the landing signal officer thought they were good enough, they would send them out the next day in groups to go and land on the carriers.
And
what
we see now is filmed at those training carriers.
Yeah. So as you can tell, it didn't always go perfect, right?
No.
And yeah, so over the course of the 3-year period, about 130 of the aircraft actually ended up in the lake. And interesting thing is they ran it all year long, and the qualification training all year long. And I guess you would call it the official Navy records say that 8 pilots were killed. And I say a few more were killed, and there's a reason I say a few more were killed. But the 8 pilots that died, for the most part, died simply from exposure. And the reason that is if you crashed in January and it took a little bit for the crash boat to get to you, well, you might freeze to death, basically, right? Yeah. Now, why I say there was a few more that died is 2 pilots died actually after they qualified, and they had a mid-air collision over Glenview Naval Air Station, and both died. So they finished with the aircraft carriers, and then so to me, they still died in the training operation.
So one can state that from all the US Navy pilots who got training for landing and starting from an aircraft carrier, only a dozen were killed during those training in the whole Second World War.
Oh, I don't know. There was training all over the country. I don't know.
But specifically during these training sessions on Lake Michigan.
Just on Lake Michigan, there was only 8 to 12. There was a pilot and a crew member killed who I would call it horsing around. They actually went, he lived close to the area, and he went and did some sort of fancy thing to wave to his mother, and he lost control of the aircraft and he crashed. So that was horrible. Yeah, that was horrible. And then, but that's why the Navy's numbers say 8, because those are the ones who actually died in the lake. And most of those, for the most part, were exposure. They were able to escape from the aircraft, but the water was too cold.
But luckily, most of them survived because you said there were about 130 aircraft which ditched into Lake Michigan, which didn't make it to the aircraft carrier and ditched in Lake Michigan. The lake itself, how deep is it?
Well, the deepest part of the lake is about 950 feet, about 300 meters.
That's quite deep.
That's pretty deep. The area that the aircraft are in what's called the Southern Basin, which the deepest part of the Southern Basin gets to about 500 to 600 feet, which is 250 meters maybe. All right. Now, most of the aircraft are fairly close to Chicago. Chicago area is actually pretty shallow. So we find most of the aircraft from about 150 to 300 feet deep, or a little under 90 meters, right? A little, yeah.
So you're still able to dive, so diver can get to the wreckage.
Some of them, and then Keith, roll some more video for us, right? So we can see. So the deep ones, we use what's called a remote operated vehicle, and we will have some video footage coming up of some remote operated vehicles, and it's a robot. It's an underwater robot, and
yeah.
That's how actually when they're over the acceptable limit for scuba diving, we use the remote operated vehicle to attach and to videotape and all that sort of stuff. It's actually pretty complex.
Yeah, but we went a few steps too far, because first of all, you've got to find out, I guess, from archives or eyewitnesses, where these aircraft came down in the lake. Tell us something about that.
Yeah. Okay. So when you talk to a person who doesn't know a lot about it, they think you put a set of scuba gear on, jump in Lake Michigan, and there's a whole bunch of airplanes, you can see them, right? Well, they don't realize Lake Michigan is the area that we look for the aircraft is about 40 by 50 miles, right? So during the war, the Allies had what was called radar, and these ships had radar on them. And when an aircraft would crash, they would take a radar position. They would get a fix off Chicago Harbor, Michigan City Harbor. These are some of the harbors in that area. And then they would triangulate, and they would say the distance to the harbor and an azimuth. So we went through the logbooks and we looked at all of that. Well, anyone who does this kind of thing knows that the X doesn't mark the spot. So you need sonar equipment, and the type of sonar equipment we use is called a side scan sonar. And what that does is it draws us a map of the bottom and shows us everything that's on the bottom. So we specifically would look for an aircraft, but we would find ships, we'd find pleasure boats, we'd find all kinds of stuff. Aircraft are what we were after, and so that's how we find them. So we get a nice image of them. So anyway, so there you have it.
And then you will organize the lifting up of the aircraft out of the lake, which I understand can be 100 meters, 300 feet, or even deeper. That requires, I think, a lot of money.
Yeah, it requires a lot of money. So I think you're asking how does it get paid for?
Yes.
All right. Well, all right. So we do this under the direction of the National Naval Aviation Museum. And when we first started doing it, we were doing it for other museums, right? And they I don't know how they would raise money, but they would raise money, and then they would pay for this sort of stuff. But the management of the National Naval Aviation Museum, there's a thing in U.S. law called Title 10, United States Code, Section 2572, which is specific for the it's specific for the enhancement of the Department of Defense historic collections. And so what they're able to do is they are able to trade, exchange, they call it an exchange, the old junk that they have, that the Department of Defense throws away. There's this place out in the desert where they take all the old aircraft and stuff, and they put it out there for a little while. They always say they're going to use it for something else, but after a while, they chop it all up and melt it back down for scrap. Well, the directors of the museums in the U.S. Department of Defense are theoretically supposed to be able to use that to make an exchange for or trade to get the stuff like we do done. So back in the early 90s, the director and deputy director of the National Naval Aviation Museum would offer us stuff. Like they offered us what's called an HU-16 Albatross. This is a giant airplane. And they said, how about we give you that and you recover some aircraft for us, right?
And that was a flying example. You could fly with it.
Well, yeah. And so once you get it, once we got it, we could do whatever we wanted. We could keep it, play with it. In our case, we sold it to somebody who wanted to fly it. So like that's an example. They gave us that. We recovered some aircraft. We actually got some crazy pilots to get in the thing, fly it to another place, and then we had a broker that was able to sell it. Anyway, so then what happened though is there's always people who have to mess up a good thing. And so there was these people who messed up that whole program of the exchanges. So then what we've had to do for the past 20 years, because the first 10 years we were able to use that exchange program, but then the last 20 years we've had to go out and get donors. We had to go get people who would willing to donate, and they don't just donate to us locating the aircraft and recovering the aircraft. They have to donate to the entire restoration and display of the aircraft. So it's really expensive. And we've been lucky because we've had donors like Andy Taylor from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, who funded an aircraft in honor of his father and the founding of Enterprise Rent-A-Car. We've had a man named Chuck Greenhill that's donated and funded 2 aircraft, recoveries to 2 aircraft. And we've even had things, well, we've had obvious donors like Boeing Aircraft, right? It's very obvious. Boeing, Douglas Aircraft is, and is part of Boeing. But we've had the former chairman of the former chief executive officer of McDonald's Corporation was responsible for at least 3 of the projects. So
his name, McDonald's, who's selling the hamburgers.
McDonald's selling the hamburgers. Yeah.
So Donald McDonald, who he paid you for retrieving.
Well, they don't pay. Yeah, they don't pay us. That's a misconception.
Yeah.
We have there's a support organization called the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. So they're the people that actually they manage the contracts and they manage. So when people say that the Navy contracted us, that's really not true. The Naval Aviation Museum Foundation contracts us. And so a person like Fred Turner, the former CEO of McDonald's, would donate to that, and then they would contract us to do it. But it's very interesting that people such as that see the importance in this.
Yeah.
So and he's been and anyway, he's very, just amazing. He's no longer alive, but it's just amazing. So, and they see the importance of what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Why are those aircraft so important for the Naval Aviation Museum? Because I understood that some of the aircraft you retrieved are on display in other parts of the United States, in other museums.
Yeah. So when we first started recovering, like I'll give you an example. The first set of aircraft we recovered, we recovered a Wildcat fighter for the Cradle of Aviation Museum on Long Island, New York. And that was important because they called it the Cradle of Aviation. there was a number of aircraft companies back 100 years ago that were on Long Island, New York. And so they wanted a Wildcat fighter because Grumman Aircraft was on Long Island, New York, and their museum highlights a lot of Grumman aircraft. So we recovered that. Well, right after we recovered that, we were approached by the Yorktown Aircraft Carrier Association for the Yorktown Aircraft Carrier at Patriots Point, South Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina. And they wanted, what they were trying to do for their collection is get an example of every type of aircraft that ever had flown off the deck of their aircraft carrier. So they contracted us to get a Wildcat fighter and a SBD Dauntless. Well, a new director was coming in into National Naval Aviation Museum, Captain Rasmussen, and he looked at their collection. And guess what? They didn't have an SBD in their collection. They didn't have aircraft that were had been veterans of the war. So, because I think everybody who's watching this, listening to us, knows that at the end of the War Department, the U.S. War Department took stuff out into the ocean and dumped it out. They didn't, for some reason, they didn't think of saving this stuff to show people later.
Yeah. So what's important to know is that the aircraft that you recover sometimes have a rich combat history, because the aircraft which were used for training were older aircraft which came from the combat zone, which have been in, I don't know, Midway or Pearl Harbor or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So so Captain Rasmussen, he contacted us and realized, and he said, we know that there's combat veterans out there. And then, so there was, and he knew there was a lot of aircraft that were, had been in Operation Torch. I don't know if your viewers all know, I'm sure you know, Operation Torch was considered like the U.S. first in the European theater.
Yeah.
Was considered our entry into the European theater of the war. We had been in the Pacific theater of the war well before Operation Torch, but for some reason there was a whole lot of SBD Dauntlesses that had been in Operation Torch. They ended up at the bottom of Lake Michigan. So he knew about those. But if you look at the video you're watching right now, this is an aircraft, SBD Dauntless 2106, also known as Midway Madness. This aircraft is the most significant artifact in all the United States Navy's historic collection.
Okay.
It's it's very interesting because it was at Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was attacked. It somehow it made its way to Marine Corps pilots out on the island of Midway, and a pilot named Danny Iverson got in the aircraft with his gunner, and apparently they hadn't been trained in dive bombing yet, so they only knew how to glide bomb. So he took that aircraft with his gunner, flew out, attacked with his squadron mates, attacked the Japanese Armada. He got hit, I don't know, 200 times or whatever. He was wounded. His gunner was wounded. He came back, did a gear up landing, and then the two of them hopped into another SBD and attacked him again. So, because he was able to bring that one back to Midway Island, well, after the battle, they took it back. They brought it out to Glenview Naval Air Station, and then about a year later, another pilot crashed with it in Lake Michigan, and that's how it was saved, because it was crashed in Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and they had us go get it and recover it. So,
well, we've got here already some reactions on the chat box. So we've got greetings from Poland, from Lajos Legradi, from Hungary, and from Belgium, and from Germany. So people are enjoying the show. And there's the question of a fellow member of Aviation Archaeology, Carl Winter, who asks, can you discuss briefly the most historically significant aircraft that was found and recovered from Lake Michigan? You already gave a start to it, but I propose that we will discuss some specific dives you've done and recoveries you've done.
Well, so his question though, I seem to have answered it with this aircraft S2106, but we also recovered the only Vindicator left in the world, the only SB2U Vindicator, which was that aircraft that the video had the funny looking skeleton, right? And that's the only one there is. There weren't there. Go ahead.
And can we see some images from a specific aircraft or a specific dive, and then you tell something about it? So will that be able? Will you be able to fix that technically?
Keith, I don't know. Well, yeah, we can. You want to see a little diving, huh?
Well, with a certain aircraft, don't know, and then you tell something about it.
If you look at the background of my screen right now, that actually is the bomb site for the Vindicator that we recovered, and so it's kind of interesting. I'll show you that aircraft. Okay, so there is actually that aircraft. Believe it or not, now not this one, but sister aircraft were used by Marines, squadron mates of Danny Iverson. They attacked the Japanese Armada at Midway Island in that type of aircraft, believe it or not. And it was mostly fabric covered. So we think that is actually the coolest of the aircraft, the neatest. We think at A&T Recovery, that to us is very significant, a very interesting aircraft. You know, so
yeah, you already mentioned A&T Recovery. So in fact, you created the kind of business model out of it.
Well, I wouldn't call it a business model. Nobody else in the world. I'm sorry, I have to laugh because it's Keith once did the calculation for how much he got paid for how many hours he spent on it. And he found out that if he had worked for that McDonald's making hamburgers and they only paid him about $4 an hour, he would have made a whole lot more money. Al and I figured out that if we only lost $4 an hour, we would have a lot more money. We don't do this. It's not about making money. You know who makes the money? The insurance company makes the money.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we've got a question from Belgium, from Benny Keulaars from Plane Hunters, who says it looks dangerous to dive under a lifted aircraft. Did you ever have accidents or whatever? Or
no, we don't have any accidents. Now that doesn't mean we haven't had any accidents, but that doesn't correlate. We're still stupid, right? I have a joke. I should have died 1,000 times. Now, that being said, we know what we're doing, right? And every now and then, to get a good photo, or one of the divers will do something. And I think he probably saw Keith underneath a Wildcat, probably looking for something, right? And yeah, when we started doing this, we were young and dumb, and we thought we were invincible. And so every now and then we do something stupid. So, but we've been lucky. We have never had an accident. So.
And how many people are involved during the operation?
I'm glad you mentioned that. They're on our vessel. There's only a handful of people on our vessel. We have me and Al, Keith, diving. Keith is diving. There's Paul and Bruce diving, Todd logistics. Pretty much that's mostly who's on the boat. But then there's an entire marina crew, right? There's Mike Shield and Doug Larson who run the cranes. And then we actually turn the aircraft over once we get on shore to Pete Spear and Ty, who never says his last name. Actually, he doesn't say anything other than get out of my way. We turn it over to them. So there's an entire marina crew, forklift driver. Mike Shield is the crane operator, does all those people. And then once we're done with it, we turn it over to the restorers, whether it's the Kalamazoo Aviation History Museum or some other restoration group. And they have hundreds of volunteers, all sorts of people. There's people even before the recovery that are heavily involved, the Army Corps of Engineers, all the staff of the National Naval Aviation Museum, the staff of the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. There's the truck drivers. It takes hundreds, if not thousands of people for every one of these things. There's the researchers at the archives, the National Archives that help us, the Army, the Kathy Chernich and her team at the Army Corps of Engineers, Chicago District Office.
Mhm.
It's amazing how many people. There's and then there's all the media. There's all the media people out there that help promote it. You know,
Yeah.
it's thousands of people.
Once the aircraft are brought on shore, they are under restoration, I guess, or conservation. There's another question from Benny from Belgium. Are there planes restored to flying condition from the lake?
Yes, there are. There are. The so interesting thing, the directors, the management of the National Naval Aviation Museum are generally pilots and they love aircraft. All right. Aircraft do not belong at the bottom of lakes, right? Aircraft are made to fly. So during the exchanges under Title 10, United States Code, Section 2572, they were able to exchange a number of the airframes, including 3 to us that they just told us we could have them still in the bottom of Lake Michigan. And those aircraft have been turned over to private entities. Three, and I don't know exactly where the other ones are right now, but to date, 3 have been made to fly. 2 Wildcat fighters, Grumman Wildcats, F4, F3s, and an SBD Dauntless have been made to fly.
Well, I can imagine that lots of parts have to be changed, or is the condition of the metal so good that it can remain on the plane and still fly?
I am the wrong person to ask that question. That's a restoration thing. But I just know an awful lot of the original parts of the aircraft are still on the aircraft flying.
Okay.
I just know that. I don't have the patience to do anything with restoration myself.
We see some fascinating pictures of the aircraft, and they are in an amazing condition. I think it's important to know whether or not Lake Michigan is saltwater or...
Well, Lake Michigan is freshwater.
Freshwater.
And so that was beneficial at first.
Yeah.
When we first started, when the aircraft went in the water, Lake Michigan was freshwater, very cold and very dark. When you get to the bottom, after about 80 feet, 20 something meters, it would get very dark. And the aircraft were very well protected during that time period. And what happened though is in the late 1980s, early 90s, an invader entered the lake, and that's called the zebra mussel. And then
Mussel.
Yeah, mussel, a type of mussel. It's
okay. Tiny,
it's little, size of your. So it entered the lake, and and then later its cousin called the guaga mussel came, which was even tougher. The original zebra mussels only went down to about 80 feet deep, about 20 meters. And then the guaga mussels, they go down to hundreds of feet deep. The problem with these things now, these mussels, are they excrete just like every other living organism. They excrete things. And they excrete a uric acid. And I don't know how many millions of these things will cover an aircraft now. They cover everything. They're destroying everything that's on the bottom of Lake Michigan, whether it's a shipwreck, whether it's an aircraft. And what's happening is they are submerging the aircraft in a uric acid bath. So
there's definitely a reason to retrieve the wrecks, because in 100 years they will all be gone.
Oh, I actually would say in 15 years, definitely less than 20 years, all the aircraft that were in Lake Michigan will be reduced to nothing but aluminum oxide. They are crumbling. They are just turning
That's
into
quite a
sediment.
statement, meaning that you've been doing this kind of work since how many years? 20 years, 25 years?
Well, we actually found we actually found our first aircraft in 1977,
Oh,
and then we started recovering them about 10 years later, 12 years later, and so we've been doing it a long time. When the aircraft you're seeing on the screen right now is the one that we placed in Midway Airport. When that aircraft was recovered, that all that skin you see on there is all its original, for the most part, its original skin. And,
okay.
you know, we recovered that in the early 1990s before the mussels could have a chance to destroy it.
There was a question from Lajos Legradi. I'm sorry, probably I don't say it correctly. He's from Hungary, and he asked approximately how many aircraft remains today in Lake Michigan, because it seems you've got already retrieved a lot of them.
Yeah, so we retrieved somewhere near 40.
40 aircraft.
40, yes, right? And they're on display throughout the US. They're all over. Museums and airports all over the country. The most prestigious museums, the most prestigious. The National Museum of the United States Marine Corps, you know, the aircraft carrier, different aircraft carrier museums, the Yorktown, the Hornet, the Lexington, the USS Midway, San Diego Air and Space, National Naval Aviation Museum, National Museum of the Pacific War. So we, Midway International Airport, O'Hare International Airport. So they're all over, and then a whole lot of other museums. And then there's even side exhibits that don't have aircraft, but talk about it. So we recovered approximately 40. During the war, they actually were able to recover some that were in shallow water. They had a barge and they recovered. And so I estimate about 10, and then there was a few others recovered by some scuba groups, right? That recovered some, which who knows. I estimate there's still 70 aircraft left in the lake.
Because we're talking about 130 crashes in Lake Michigan during the war. Not every aircraft landed at the bottom of the lake in more or less one piece. I guess some of them just crashed on the surface of the water and were smashed into smithereens.
Most of the crashes were on takeoff or landing. So they were close to stall speed. But Keith, hey, roll the October 2019 SBD, and this will cover a number of the stuff you do. Okay, roll the 100-foot guaga mussel SBD, Keith. All right, so this will answer a bunch of the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
So here's an aircraft that had a very rough crash. So you can see the engine is dislodged. You can see the empennage broke off, right? When we located this aircraft in the 1990s, it was beautiful. It had the windshield. It had everything. Absolutely beautiful. This is what it looks like now.
So this is because of the mussels.
This is because of the mussels. It's destroying this aircraft. And in a few seconds, we're going to show you how rapidly it's destroying it. Okay? Because what the film will go to is it's going to go to the engine. When we found this aircraft, it had the most beautiful engine cowling I had ever seen. Absolutely beautiful. So if you notice in the lower right corner, this video is from 2014. Yeah. This is the engine and cowling from 2014. It had been originally standing perfectly horizontal, basically straight up with the entire cowling. The cowling was absolutely perfect. It looked like it was just removed from the airframe and put on the bottom. Now and see how it's rock bottom. In a couple seconds, you are going to see the same engine in 2019. Do you notice the entire cowling has corroded and is gone? Yeah. That's 5 years.
Oh my God.
It's gone, absolutely gone. And that is just the result of the guaga mussel activity. That's how bad this situation is becoming.
Yeah.
The aircraft that now that being said, the Kalamazoo Aviation History Museum, or the Air Zoo, would like us to recover that aircraft.
It's still
And
at
they
the
want,
bottom there.
yeah, and they want to put it on display to teach students about invasive species, marine aquatic environments, that sort of thing. Of course, we have obstruction to that, and the obstruction comes from, anyway, I'll skip it. So, anyway.
Okay, interesting. So
Yeah.
are there still wrecks with the painting on it, like on the picture behind you? Or are all these wrecks in this condition gone? Or
Well,
already retrieved by you?
well, right now, I would say they're all that kind of stuff is gone. And you can see how beautiful that was, right?
Yeah.
And the deeper you go, the better off they'll be, right? So right now we're looking at aircraft at about 400 feet deep, hoping that we will be able to raise the funding to recover them and get them on display before they turn into the aircraft you just saw.
Yeah.
Okay? Because the guaga mussels, we were down at 500 something feet last year, and the guaga mussels were attaching themselves to little rocks that were this big at that deep.
Yeah.
So any aircraft down there, the guaga mussels will soon take over.
So we're seeing some more fascinating pictures right now live on Facebook. Can you tell something about the aircraft we're seeing now?
Okay, so why we're showing you this is what we say, this isn't just about aircraft recovery. This is about American humanities, actually about all of our humanities, more than American humanities. It's about all the Allies' humanities and everything else. And anyone who knows anything about World War II knows that all the cultures of the world became involved, right? And it was unbelievable what happened. And so this aircraft is Dauntless Bureau, Dauntless, it's SB-2P, Bureau number 2173. And the 2P stands for, well, it's a type 2 variant, but it was one of about 15 photo reconnaissance aircraft, Dauntless photo reconnaissance aircraft. This aircraft has extensive combat history, very significant aircraft, funded primarily by Fred Turner, the former chairman of the board, former chief executive officer of McDonald's Corporation. And he funded it on behalf of the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. And the aircraft had been at Pearl Harbor, then it went out to the Pacific, did a lot of stuff in combat, and then ended up getting lost in Lake Michigan. The pilot survived the crash just fine, but then was killed later on in the war. So Fred Turner funded the recovery and most of the restoration. The family of the pilot has augmented the restoration, which is all being conducted, and you're going to love this, is all being conducted at the Kalamazoo Aviation History Museum, and also known as the Air Zoo, and it's being conducted by artisan volunteer restorers and school students. So
Okay.
we use a phrase, we say e pluribus unum, which is a phrase in America which means from many one. And so all of these people from all these different parts of the country and everywhere else, and there's people that are from other countries that have participated as well, all work together on this aircraft.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. And so, and when you, and of course you see the humor that we have at A&T Recovery, you can see what I'm doing,
Okay.
right? And so I'm more interested in the hula dancers than anything else at that point. That's just another airplane, right? So anyway, but and if you notice now, if you notice the photo in my background,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that right there is the engine of that aircraft.
Okay.
And that is a artisan restorer working with a young child.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
Very nice.
on that aircraft.
Well, there is another question of Carl Winter. I understand Terrace and AT&T Recovery have been involved in recoveries of aircraft in other locations, such as the SB-2C from Otay Reservoir in California, USA. Can you confirm that, or?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a fun story. All right. So
Oh, that was not in Lake Michigan. That was in the other
no,
part of the country of the States. Yeah.
no, that wasn't in Lake Michigan. So the video you're watching, a fisherman, a freshwater fisherman named Dwayne Johnson was crossing over Otay Reservoir. Now, you have to put this in perspective. Otay Reservoir is the freshwater supply for the city of San Diego. This is like their drinking water. Now, here's some video of the aircraft on the bottom that Dwayne Johnson found. The bottom of that reservoir is nothing but muck, nasty muck, and you'll see, right? So there was a person who passed away who left in his estate funding so we could recover this aircraft. And there's a reason I'm saying it this way. So anyway, so the director of the National Naval Aviation Museum sent us out there. And this is Keith's video looking at it. And there's a funny thing about the bureau numbers. There was a mix up on the bureau numbers, but you'll have to read my book to find out about that. Anyway, so about a year later, they had the funding from the person who had passed away, and we went out and recovered the aircraft. The thing that I'd like to say is, I don't know how anybody does any work in California, because those people are crazy. So they put requirements on us that they had no concept of what it's like to work underwater, or I don't know how to get any work done. I was kind of asking them how policemen and firemen work there with all the requirements, the restrictions they put on us. And so anyway, we took us about a week, but we got the muck out of it, and we got it out of the muck, and here you have it. Here we're recovering it. Now, if you look, you'll see a whole lot of people in red shirts. So the A&T recovery crew is actually kind of tiny, but one of the aircraft carriers was in port, and they sent out a request, and a whole bunch of sailors came and volunteered, and it was great. So we had I think it's the San Diego Park District. They call them the Ranger Divers. They were on the project to augment us. And then the Navy sailor volunteers came and helped us.
Okay, that's great. What are your future projects, Terrace?
Well, of course, we'd like to get a whole lot more aircraft out of the lake, right? And we'd like to get the one we showed you. And then what we've changed our thought process. There's a whole lot of TBF Avengers that we would like to get to museums that would like to display them just as they are. We'd like to do that. We think there's about 5-6 aircraft that should be recovered, SPDs and Wildcats that should be recovered to be restored and displayed, right? And then, anyway, and then we'd also like to recover a German World War I submarine U-boat.
Oh,
that's at the bottom. We'd like to do that.
About that.
You want to know about that?
Yeah, sure. We're also interested in submarines.
Yeah. Um, so I guess we have to tell you first. People say, how could that be, right? How could there be a submarine in the lake? Well, believe it or not, there is a World War I U-boat. What happened at the end of World War II, the German Navy, I mean, at the end of World War I, not World War II, sorry, I have to backtrack. The German Navy had to surrender all its warships. And the way it read was they had to surrender their warships to the Allies in the United States of America, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why they separated the United States of America. Well, there was 170 something submarines, and they brought most of them to Harwich. Now, I've never been to Harwich, but those people in England probably know it better than I do. I guess it's a very large port. They brought all these submarines there, and then everybody divided them up. And the Americans got 6 of them, and I don't know who got what, but the Japanese got some, the Americans got 6. And the American brought their 6 over. They called it the former German Submarine Expeditionary Force when they crossed the Atlantic. They brought them to New York, and then they separated them, and they took them on bond drives. Well, this submarine, the UC-97, and it's what was called a coastal mine layer. It was supposed to go to mine enemy harbors, was what it was supposed to do. It never saw any action. It never actually was commissioned in the German Navy. It didn't make it. It was getting ready for sea trials. It was commissioned in the U.S. Navy, and then so it was commissioned as the USS UC-97 ex-German submarine. That's what its name was. Anyway, but by a certain time in 1921, the armistice said that the Allies had to destroy all those surrendered warships. So what they did was they took this out into Lake Michigan and they shelled it with a training boat, which that training boat actually, if you're from Chicago, that training boat is very historic. It was called the USS Wilmette. Prior to that, it was called the Eastland, which was a terrible tragedy in the Chicago area. It was the worst marine tragedy in the Great Lakes ever. It killed about 805 people in a minute. Whoa. When it flipped over the Chicago River. The Navy took it, made it a training gunboat, and that's the only thing it really ever shot at was this submarine. So the submarine, they sank it in 1921, and we found it in about 1992. And we've been trying for years to find the right people that would love to see it restored and on display. So it's pretty cool. It's kind of neat, you know. So it's a beautiful shape.
Yeah, so. Sure. You've been in contact with German associations or so, because they should be interested in retrieving such a relic as well.
I haven't spoken to any. So the Royal Navy did speak to me about it, though. The United Kingdom Royal Navy, Great Britain's Royal Navy did, and the way I take it is they want me to recover it. They like the idea, so they So
that's a future project for your ANT recovery.
That's the ones we'd like to do.
Well, when I was reading To Return to Aircraft, I read a fascinating story in your book about the guy who killed himself with an aircraft. And you had to recover, you had to find him. Can you tell us something about that? Because that's also a very weird story. Or do you want first give some comment to the aircraft we see right now? Because
sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, all right. So this here is a F4U-1 birdcage Corsair.
Birdcage Corsair.
Yeah, it was like the original Corsair design. And what you just saw was when we first found it in the 90s. And now you'll see our divers horsing around because it's 250 feet deep and they don't normally do that. But if you just recall the video before that, that was pre-guaga mussel, and look at this is after the guaga mussel, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
So a man named Chuck Greenhill, okay, funded the recovery and a good part of the restoration of this aircraft. And it's interesting because this shouldn't have ever been in Lake Michigan, because my understanding is the Navy said, do not land these aircraft on aircraft carriers because they were too difficult. What would happen is when the pilot was turning to come to final, and on the final approach to the aircraft carrier, he couldn't see the landing signal officer because of the design of the aircraft. I don't know if this is correct, but they say the British figured out how to land them on the deck of aircraft carriers. And I guess what they didn't, they wouldn't square off their base and their approach. They would just kind of stay in a bank so they could see the landing signal officer the whole time. So what we're looking at here is, first we saw it when we first found it, and that was shot. Remember we were talking about the ROV, the remote operated vehicle? That was the first video. Then you saw the divers doing technical diving, horsing around. They do that on their own, whenever they feel like. And then this is during the recovery process, bringing it in so it's being suspended below the water line. And then in a couple seconds, you will actually see us lifted out of water. Now, what happens between this point and being lifted out of the water, the divers attempt, for the media and films and all the rest, the divers attempt, I want to say something. Pay attention to what the diver's doing right now. The diver knows something's wrong there, so he's attempting to fix something. All right, you can see he's concerned about something. So so remember that. This here is the accident card from the records that explains the crash in the lake, right? And anyway, so what happens is between that point and when we lift it out of the water, the divers attempt to clean as much of the guaga mussels off as they can. The reason for that is you want some, when they put it on the media, the news, you want it to look as good as you can, right? Yeah, you don't want it just to look like a pile of mud, right? So this here is the ship's log page from the records. And if you could, you won't be able to see it because it'll go pretty quick, but there was no position recorded for this aircraft. We located this aircraft just by knowing how to figure out where it should be. So there was no position. It was just out in the lake. We knew an approximate depth. So you'll see now where the divers have see how they cleaned it off pretty well. You're not going to see this. Yeah.
Please, sirs.
Now, if you notice up the cowling, okay. Now, did you see that? What happened? The diver knew something was wrong there, and he was trying to fix it. So anyway, but we have redundant systems, so nothing bad happened. But if you know, anyway, the guaga mussels, you can tell the guaga mussels, if you look right by the engine, the guaga mussels have done a lot of damage right there. So if we were going to recover this aircraft today, you wouldn't see F-21 and most of the skin would be pretty bad. Would be pretty bad. But this was 10 years ago, so it was still pretty good, right? So
what fascinates me is that many of the aircraft being retrieved from Lake Michigan have their landing gear down.
Yeah, well, because they crashed generally either on takeoff or landing. So I think we've only recovered one that the landing gear was up. You know, and that actually is a real sad story. The one that the landing gear was up because the Navy didn't, the ships didn't even know they lost the aircraft.
Oh my God!
And the pilot ditched in the lake with he had engine trouble and he ditched in the lake. Of course he wanted to pull his landing gear up to make a good ditching. So anyway, so you asked about a person who died in the aircraft. Keith Bland Stewart, please. So so an associate of ours was reading the Wall Street Journal, and he saw an article about a guy who was being hunted, a manhunt by the FBI. And that's the man, D. Bland Stewart. the FBI was looking for him all over the world. And he was last known to have taken a private aircraft from Vero Beach, Florida, to somewhere over a lake called Lake Martin in Alabama. And Lake Martin is in a very hilly area, and it's a man-made lake that they built a dam on a river, and then they made this big lake, right? So it twists and turns, and it's all over. Well, one night in 1988, he sent a radio message. He was having engine trouble, and he disappeared. And so people thought that he faked the plane crash. Well, we know a lot about plane crashes, so we looked at all the evidence, and we realized he was in the lake. So his family retained us to go find him because the insurance companies would not pay the insurance money, his life insurance. And it took us a couple days and we found him. And he was there. And if you notice on the dashboard, you could see where his head had hit. And that's what happened when he crashed. He hit his head too hard and knocked himself unconscious, and he drowned in the aircraft. But it was a pretty wild story. And we ended up there used to be a television program, America's Most Wanted, which looked at all the different people the FBI was looking at. So we ended up on that program. Well, actually, they didn't interview us. They just had films of us. And it was kind of a wild week. It was a cultural experience for us because we're from the North, and was in the South. And if you ever spend any time in America, people in the South are different than people in the North. And so we were a lot different. The sheriff told me that he knew I was a damn liar.
Okay.
Right from the beginning when he met me, he said, "I know you're a damn liar." Anyway.
And besides the U-boats, are there other projects?
There's the
on aircraft specifically?
Do you mean are there other things we have found that are neat?
Or no, that you will retrieve in the future?
Well, aircraft and the U-boat, shipwrecks are difficult. They fall apart on you. Yeah. In Great Britain, they're doing the Mary Rose, and then the Vasa is sweet. And, those things are tens of millions of dollars of projects, but we have located loads of shipwrecks. There's shipwrecks everywhere. And then we located something over 8,000 years old.
Yeah, tell us something about that, because that's also a very intriguing chapter of your book.
Yeah, Keith gets a lot of credit for that because he just wanted to mess with it. It's called the early Holocene forest, and Holocene means less than 10,000 years old. The funny part about this is all the great geniuses that know all about marine exploration couldn't figure out how we found this. And for years, and it was short, but you saw that. What you saw, those were tree stumps sitting at the bottom of the lake. And so the theory was that 12,000 years ago, glaciers came and carved out Lake Michigan, and then they melted, right? Well, we found out that wasn't true. The glaciers carved out the Lake Michigan, but then the water went away. And so over 8,000 years ago, where those tree stumps were, there was water. How the tree stumps survived underwater for 8,000 years, who knows, right? But what the big thing was is they couldn't figure out how we found that. And I don't know, they thought we were looking for shipwrecks. We said, we don't really look for shipwrecks, right? And Keith had a line, he said, "Leave it to a Navy pilot to crash in the trees." How we found it was one of the aircraft crashed, and it landed in the middle of those tree stumps. And Keith was looking at the tree stumps, and he took a piece off and he gave it to a geologist who did a radiocarbon dating on it and found out it was over 8,000 years old. The interesting thing about that is that aircraft is the one now on display. It's the SPD now on display at Midway Airport. So anyway, so that's how that was found. The tree stumps was found. So
There is another question from Danny K. What ROV do you use?
We like Mitsui RTV 100s.
Okay, so that question is answered as well.
We like them. They're fiber optic. They're easy for us to handle. We like them. We have multiples of them.
Okay. So, Darius, we're on air for more than an hour now. So I guess it's our turn to land safely. The first show.
I can't do that. No way.
Oh, you want to continue?
No, we can do it again. We can do another one. Yeah. I was making a joke. We can't land safely. No way. No way.
Oh.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, yeah, you're right. We've been on a long time, but we can do another one, or we can do whatever you guys want.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Darius, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank our two technicians to manage this first show. Thank
Keith
you
and
very
Nicole.
much. I'm sorry?
Keith and Nicole, yeah.
Keith and Nicole. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to post some information about the book you wrote, where they can order your book. It's very well written with lots of intriguing photographs and stories. So I wish you every success with your future projects, and maybe we'll see each other again in the near future.
Sounds good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Darius. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.